Greetings, my name is Michael Miller. This is a Michael Miller trademark training video out to you because you're watching. Thank you and welcome. It's meant for Michael Miller Pilates licensed affiliates, the Core New Core, my patrons, Clayton and Ruby and Stephanie and Jonathan. I got a text asking me who they were, what the deal was. And if nothing else, I hope they become creators themselves and find patrons of their own. And is meant for, this broadcast is meant for anyone interested in surviving and thriving as a Pilates instructor or student. There's just two things on my list today. And whereas yesterday seemed to be all sign language of very fundamental MMP, today, title number 1 is the difference between the garage and the track. And title number 2 is shoulder workshop. Okay, so on Facebook, I can type in the titles and they're visible as part of the video that comes with it. And here I have to share it with you verbally, because I don't know how, if it's even possible to do that in YouTube. So what is the difference between the garage and the track, like racetrack, right? And I guess you have to decide relative to what, and let's say the car, right? The car in which the garage works on the car in the garage, and the car goes out on the track and runs around. Okay? So at first, my first point on that seemed to be it's about movement, which is relevant to a Pilates instructor, and that one's moving and what isn't. But really, it's not that things don't move in the garage, but things have a different point or purpose out on the track and move much faster. So in terms of movement, the rate of movement, how fast things are going, is part of the distinction between whether you're in the garage or running around on the track. So originally this came to me as the question, are you the mechanic or the co-pilot? And of course, at least half of the chorus stands up and says, well, you can be both, and you are both. And you're both simultaneously. And I think that's all true. But sometimes the distinction is lost between acting as the mechanic and riding co-pilot, riding shotgun, or being the co-pilot. What does that mean? Well, the co-pilot or the riding shotgun means you're not the driver, right? So in this sense, the metaphor that I'm weaving, of course, is that the Pilates instructor acts as the mechanic in the garage, trying to fix things in the body, or improve things in the body, that then is meant to go out on the track and run around. The question is, when does the running around the track occur? At the end of your Pilates session, and then it's up to you how you use the work that was done on the garage. And this is just a Now it's a narrower analogy. Okay. The other difference about being in the garage versus being out on the track, because of the rate at which things are changing, and it's that rate that determines whether or not you win or lose the race, which is a civilized form of determining surviving or not surviving. So now forgive me for going here because it's such a hackneyed, it maybe has no meaning. But in the movie Star Trek, where you're supposed to use the Force or trust the Force or whatever about the Force, it's in the thinking that surrenders much of its predominance in the garage to participate in observing as much as being, or necessarily observing becomes important because things are going so fast. You have to really pay attention. You have to observe. Right? And so in that regard, boy, strike a big chord for Joseph Pilates as a survivor, was a survivor. His method is survival training. Right? When it comes to winning a race, you survive in the racing. When it comes to Pilates, you survive in the results of your indulgence in what it takes to do Pilates. Routine, either the choreography itself or a facsimile thereof, in pursuit of the observing that's necessary to accomplish what you're after. As much as you take observing out on the racetrack and how necessary it is for survival, observing, whatever that is, I attribute it to something outside of thinking and consider it to be in the area of hippocampus and amygdala as information that gets into thinking. So, when you think about body, mind, and spirit, you can consider all of that just within the human being or not. But in doing so, it's interesting that there is a distinction between thinking and observing. It's as simple as that. And, well, as profound and as threatening as that is to someone that only lives in their thinking, it makes no sense and gets you nowhere to challenge someone who is unaware of the role that observing plays in the pursuit of Pilates. And that's all I care about. Being a Pilates instructor in pursuit of the experience. And in the experience, in pursuit of the experience, you're not the mechanic fixing things while things are going slower, or you're where you're actually trying to do what you want to do, which is move with intent and in flow in the pattern of the mat, do the mat. And in that regard, I see that as being a co-pilot, being, what was the other word I used? Co-pilot. Riding shotgun. And riding shotgun fits in with my other imagery of Pilates in one word is exercise, Pilates in two words is corrective exercise, and the corrections coming off of the sensation of the movement that's happening. And because the student, as a beginner, doesn't know how to concentrate on or pay attention to the sensation that's coming out of the effort, the instructor is inside of the student dancing with themselves, meaning being aware of their sensation. Right? How does that happen? From observing. So, and it's not really any big deal. And it's only telling the thinking that's going on that it's getting a lot of its input from someplace. And that may be the amygdala and hippocampus, if you want to think and divide things into and assign names, right? And it's in the differences in characteristics between prefrontal cortex and thinking, and amygdala and hippocampus, which are connected to what's going on out there rather than what's going on in here. It's data for the processing going on. So, what would be sad is if the Pilates that you are familiar with only exists within the garage and never gets on the track to run around. Number two. So, on social media, there's a workshop coming up on the shoulder. Shoulders, the shoulder girdle. That suggests information that's beyond what dance might know and beyond what Pilates might know. So that's intriguing. And it brings to mind the shoulder dance, which was a highly choreographed shoulder rehabilitation sequence. And why I call that to mind to you, because I'm trying to share with you the MMP point of view and the identification of core new tension. Even if you don't believe it's real, even if you just consider it a generalized subjectification of imagery, it still is pretty good. See? As a way of looking at things. And where am I going on this? Oh, shoulder girdle. I would be wondering in that shoulder girdle if they acknowledge the axis of rotation that the shoulder girdle, or the shoulders, the musculature from like here to here, right? Shoulder girdle. Like that, shoulders. To what extent there's any acknowledgement of or recognition of, there's rotation that occurs at the shoulder girdle. And see, that begs the question, is there any recognition that the rotation at the shoulders connects to the rotation at the hips? Because if the hips are just a lump of the human body, it's got a lot of musculature in it, but doesn't have any really, that you deny rotational capability in, then we're not, see, it's like you're here, and once you even go up a little bit, you got to go all the way, because that's where you get to. So, shoulder girdle, lats and serrats, right? Pull the strength of that, and then that would just pop your ribs right out, except for what? Except for the body flies the TVA to get to the hips, meaning the ribs connect to the transverse abdominis, and it's through that muscular chain all the exotic work on muscular chains and what I've seen recently about spiral torsions from the head all the way down and through and around to the opposite foot. It's like, yeah, right. I can recognize that. But can you make the context simpler and more abstract to the reality that spiral is occurring in, and you get to core new tension. You get to the purity of the shoulders in the body having the width that it does, or to the extent that it has width, and it controls the rotation along that width. You have a stabilizing influence on that axis you create through the rotational dynamic you're creating. And to pick it apart and say, okay, we're going to have a workshop on the shoulders, which it's like saying we're going to have a workshop on spondylolisthesis is the word that's in my head, but I meant just more basically curvature of the spine. And if I don't go at that word just right, I never really get a hold of it until later. Like the shape of a catenary. Sometimes I wonder if any of this recording is anything other than me maintaining a routine that I'm comfortable living in. And yet when something comes up where I remember that recently, I've talked about something, it's like, oh, you did say something about that, and there is evidence of that, or you don't have to say more because you already said it. I see an awareness of how our body, how our biology accomplishes the physics, coming more and more clearly into the picture. And so, on this workshop on the shoulders, it's like, I can so see how it's so complicated. The anatomy, the bones, the muscles, the tendons, the variability of, the flexibility of range. See? It gets very complicated. Just imagine trying to program a robot, and you can program a robot to go forward and back, and that would be pretty good. And then in 3D space you might want to go left and right, and then be able to make rotation. And then you start getting into having a whole limb that can just reach up and grab what it wants and come back in, there's a whole lot of sophisticated movement going on. So it's always interesting to see what anybody has to say about dealing with the shoulder. For me, only to the extent that, not only to, but to the extent that it contributes to driving around the track. No, and I don't, it's such a complicated subject today. I've talked about the biology seeking to accomplish the physics. And in accomplishing the physics, there's ideal within the physics. So in doing the mat, you're pursuing the ideal. And in doing so, what becomes real out of your effort is as close to ideal as you can manage in that moment. So, I mean, here we are talking about Pilates, but we're talking about a workshop on just the shoulders. That's something beyond dance and Pilates, which makes me wonder if it's what it's oriented around. And especially makes me curious as to if there's any recognition of core new tension or what is there that's being presented, and how is it being presented, and does it challenge or resonate with what I've always tried to share with you is an understanding of core new tension between axes, meaning oppositional rotation between axes, most efficiently distributes load and makes alignment sensational. Because you're taking something and grabbing it in 2 points and pulling it apart, and in the tension, there is straightness, and in the straightness, the great thing about Pilates is you can feel it. So, the difference between the garage and the track is the level of participation between being, thinking, and observing. One way to say it. In the garage, where time isn't so critical, thinking takes up all the air in the room, in a way. And that's why Jeanette reflected back to me how insightful it is to know that, to find the fusion of body, mind, and spirit, the fusion of those as a state of being in the body in the moment of the doing, you have to press the flow. Because when you, and in pressing the flow, what are you doing? You're accelerating the time frame, like going out on the track. The faster you go, the more your observing is required to keep you alive, to survive, to win. In the shoulder workshop, I'm really tempted to go and listen just to learn what's being presented and use it as foundation and input to help you understand what they're talking about from an MMP point of view. Curious about that. If I can afford it, I might do that. Here we are in shoulders, and if I stick my arm out, arms, but you can't see the other one, so just take both of my arms out, like they're out right away, and I rotate the arms. I'm strongest in my trunk rotating this way. Okay? But I can maintain this connection as a primary connection, of course, to the hips, and yet change the rotation from my shoulder to my elbow in a torsion. So the primary goes one way out the limb, it reverses at the joint, in this case the elbow, and then can reverse again out to the wrist. And so here you've got rotation, right? And this is a Chinese yo-yo. Way back here like this. And can, right? You can see that, right? Okay, so this at the shoulders, is it rotating this way or is it rotating this way? You can't see it now. So according to the camera, the shoulders, it's rotating this way, correct? Because if I were to roll this in tighter, that's lats and serrats and all that good stuff, wrong, right? And the opposition of this rotation is the TVA. We said, my point being now here, so that once we get the orientation right, your ability to move out your arm, is this spiral that goes out and has a change of direction in it, not just once, but twice. So rotation around an axis I consider to be called torsion, T-O-R-S-I-O-N. But I think of it like this, that your musculature, 100 million years of evolution, and your musculature out your limbs is capable of making oppositional rotation along an axis and is capable of hitting an endpoint, a joint, and then reversing that double spiral along the axis. So the key takeaway, if you're familiar at all with what I'm talking about historically and coronary tension, is that the whole shoulder girdle, however, that's okay, and that's my summary. See? MMP puts Pilates within views Pilates within an ideal context. And because it's ideal, that's a pretty big picture point of view. It may not be the whole picture, but it's big picture point of view. And coming from the big picture really helps to see how all of the pieces are striving to accomplish what's going on within the big picture. That makes sense? And the big picture is whole body, because it's about Pilates instructors. I only consider teaching human beings. And right there, it's Michael Miller Pilates is a very narrow part of the spectrum of what ways you can look at Pilates. But it's an ideal way, and because of that, it stands really far away and really close to see things in an ideal way. When you understand the dynamics and how they're being accomplished by the biology, and that the biology is accomplishing something ideal in the physics, like rotation around an axis, whatever is going on in the structure of the shoulders, because of gravity being the same for everyone, the challenge for everyone is the same throughout the body. And yet, insofar as you've got an axis of rotation at the shoulders, the strength of it counter-opposing the strength of rotation at the hips, that's really not, I mean, that's an assumption made on your ability to feel that. And if you can't then promise that that connection is there and the feeling of that connection is there. When you create tension between 2 points, alignment becomes sensational between those 2 points. To the degree that you get sophisticated in the shape of the curve these 3 points align on. I think it all sounds like science fiction in 2019. But this is my best bet to share with you the joy I get out of the way I see things. And the whole body, the big picture of recognizing that the body engages in physics to move through space, to survive. To survive, we're running, we're trying to survive. The gravity jungle. And that's no joke. And if you actually get what I'm talking about, it's open to anyone that cares to look at it and use that point of view to help them, meaning you, survive as a Pilates instructor. Know what you know. Know the distinction between being in the garage and being on the racetrack, between being a mechanic and riding shotgun. Know your objective. Because when you know your objective, what's my objective? Complete coordination of being, thinking, and observing. Well, what is that? That's prefrontal cortex and amygdala hippocampus, right? That's the MMP interpretation of Joe's definition. Life can't live forever. Read between the lines and see behind the curtain. If you have any access to any of these recordings, make use of it when you do, while you do, because I know from experience that things that become accessible also become inaccessible. That's why when someone said, "Who are those people that are patrons? What's the deal with that?" I said, well, there are people that went here and are supporting me $1 a month at a time. And you can support me more if you want. And if you don't want to support me, I encourage you to go become your own creator at patreon.com and establish levels at which people can support you. Because I think that's really the what's coming down the pike is how people get compensated is directly that way. Maybe in PayPal and Bitcoin, other Vimo. Recognize when it starts in the shoulder. It starts in the shoulder going this way and goes out to the elbow, and then it goes out to the elbow. This, I said it wrong. I'm just working this live. From the shoulder, you've got major, and then there's also opposing it going this way to the elbow, and at the elbow, it goes out to the wrist going the other way. Do you know what I mean? So it goes shoulder and in addition and really like ribs and buttocks, right? So it's this way out to the elbow, then this way to the wrist. It's much easier to understand what's going on in the physics of the limb from the intricacy of the arm, because the physics and the biology don't change from arm to leg, only function and environment and again gravity. So in legs and being a dancer, it's not about just one range of motion in terms of turned out. It's in recognizing that the leg engages itself through oppositional rotation along the axis between endpoints. And in doing so, balances the degree of rotation in any direction. See that? It's not about end range, it's about controlled range. It's about being whole body. And to be whole body, you trigger engagement between endpoints, and in the limbs, core new tension is oppositional rotation between axes. I don't really have a name for describing oppositional rotation along the same axis. So you got an arm, and a lot of your musculature can go with the main strength of that, but it's in opposition to rib cage TVA to pelvis, to this. And then at the joint of the elbow, the end point, because it's a point of rotation within my vernacular, but at the joint, those connections meet and are able to physiologically go the other direction. And in so doing, are part of the legitimacy of the integrity of the elbow. That's doing what? See, that's doing what? See the big picture. That's doing, it's best to swim through the air, to swim like a fish through an ocean of air. And you get that as much as you can through core nutention. Life can't live forever. You know, so read between the lines and see behind the curtain. Compare points of view. Know what you know. When it comes to adding 2 and 2, go become a creator on Patreon. Direct your thinking. Geist.